the explosion in sheer numbers of those living on a variety and range of benefits, totally uncontrolled mass migration, and certainly not selective migration, and people leaving the country. Not just the non-doms, but wealthy big taxpayers, young entrepreneurs leaving the country. It's a pretty grim situation. And that was all under the Conservative Party.
This important interruption is brought to you by ExpressVPN. Protect your money and your identity. Click the link in the description or scan the QR code here to get ExpressVPN right now and save up to 73% on annual plans today. Right, let's get back into it.
But now we have a Labour government and we have 8 very long days to go until the budget. I say long days because it just seems to go on forever and ever, and we get a brief or a leak of one kind and then it's denied, and frankly no one quite knows exactly what details will be in the budget. But there are a couple of things that we can predict, I think, with a very high degree of accuracy. The first is this budget, like the last one, will be an attack on aspiration, an attack on Alarm Clock Britain, an attack on those who get up in the morning. This budget will do nothing for the 5.6 million very brave men and women who act as sole traders or run their own businesses, without which the British economy, frankly, would grind to a halt. And I think we can say with some confidence that this budget will be very, very good for those who don't want to work and want to live on benefits, which is very different to a civilized society looking after those that are unable to look after themselves. And it'll be an attack on jobs. I have to say, I thought the budget last year, you can increase the minimum wage for young people, but if at the same time you bring down to £5,000 the level at which an employer starts to pay national insurance, is it any wonder that there are 50,000 fewer under 18s in employment today than there were this time last year, which culturally I think is an absolute disaster. What is clear is that the markets are increasingly nervous. I know that Andy Burnham thinks that doesn't matter, but actually the bond markets in the end are enormously powerful, as Liz Truss's government found to their cost. And amidst all of this, we have a Chancellor who is absolutely hopelessly out of her depth to a level that, frankly, it's embarrassing. It was Lee Anderson that called her Rachel from accounts during PMQs some time ago, and that really stuck. Although Lee now says he feels sorry for her on a human level, and actually, I think we can all understand that. So what we're going to get is a budget that'll be drafted by left-wing think tanks, a budget that'll be drafted by people who've never run a business, who've never had a proper job in their lives, and that's the level of disconnect that exists. Now, I do think we're setting the pace on a number of things. I thought, despite her protestations, I thought a lot of what Shabama Mahmood said yesterday was driven directly by fear that Labour are losing votes, particularly in the Red Wall, to reform. And rhetorically, we would agree with a lot of what the Home Secretary said. Indeed, there are some of us that thought it might just be a pitch. Maybe that's our next defector, I'm not sure. If her backbenchers vote against her, that could become a bigger likelihood. There was no doubt, as I say, that we led the agenda on that illegal migration is making the country very, very angry, and she said it's, tearing the country apart. But economically, it is legal migration that is doing enormous damage to the British economy, and it's been so difficult to even talk about this subject without being screamed down. But just look at the direct link between falls in productivity and the mass importation of unskilled labour. In fact, that trend has been there now for the best part of 20 years. There are enormous costs to our benefit system of those, not just illegally, but legally have come into our country. And today, Zia is going to address some of that, as indeed we've touched on before. The idea that will get put at an alternative press conference today which I understand is going on at the same time as this one, is that somehow reforms support a ballooning benefits bill, and yet we're the ones proposing the most radical cuts to benefits in numerical terms that have ever been seen in the history of this country. So I'm going to ask Zia to lay out our key 5 points today. We'll then, of course, take questions on that and anything else, as we always do. But I want you to bear in mind, with all the numbers that Zia's about to give you, these are before the Boris wave, before the Boris wave begin to become eligible. And for everything the Home Secretary has said about extending a number of years, you have to be in Britain to qualify, whether it's for ILR, whether it's for benefits, I don't see any changes happening to the Boris wave, and those numbers will start to hit by the end of this year, predicted by some think tanks to perhaps be one of the single biggest economic mistakes this country has ever made in its history. I'll now hand over for some of the details, although you might have heard them already on broadcast media this morning. I'll hand over to our Head of Policy, Zia Yusuf.
Every time you're online, your money and your identity are at risk. Scams now make up nearly 40% of all crime in the UK. That's thousands of attacks every single day. In Britain, someone has their identity stolen every 2 minutes, leaving victims with wrecked finances and years of stress. The threat is real, and you could be next. ExpressVPN is your shield against criminals. It locks down your devices, hiding your personal information and financial details from hackers, scammers, and anyone else looking to exploit you. So whether you're checking your bank, shopping, or just browsing, ExpressVPN makes you invisible to prying eyes trying to steal your money and your identity. ExpressVPN shields your data with military-grade AES 256 encryption. That's the same standard trusted by the US government to guard classified information. This is the highest level of online security you can get. So don't wait for disaster. Secure up to 14 devices at once and get powerful password protection. Real support is available 24/7 because cybercrime never sleeps. Save up to 73% on annual plans today. Every moment you hesitate is another moment you're exposed. Protect your money and protect your identity. Get ExpressVPN right now.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming and for watching if you're watching this on a live stream. So, tough decisions need to be made is the refrain of the political class for years, decades now. British citizens constantly being told that they need to tighten their belts and they've got to accept paying ever more tax for ever worse public services. While that's been happening, as we're about to lay out, there has been the most extraordinary ballooning of British taxpayer expense being funneled to foreign nationals, including on our own shores, that you could possibly believe. The British state exists to serve British citizens. That is quite a radical idea these days in Westminster, which is why Nigel gets heckled whenever he says such a thing inside the House of Commons. But that is what it is for. And so, yes, we agree. The country is in an enormous amount of debt, closing on £3 trillion, thanks to the Tories, almost tripled it on their watch. We basically have no economic growth to speak of whatsoever. Real wages have barely done anything for people in this country for the last 2 decades, and we've seen the tax burden on people in this country, tax as a percentage of GDP, at World War II highs. Again, as Nigel said, we can thank the Tory party for all of that. The question is, who is going to bear the brunt of these, quote, tough decisions? And here's our perspective. It is foreign nationals who should first bear the brunt before we ask any British citizens to make sacrifices. And that is the fundamental fault line right now in British politics. We are working incredibly hard to make Nigel Farage our next Prime Minister. And the reason for that is he will make every decision as Prime Minister, as will his Cabinet and his MPs, through the lens of what is in the interests of British people. So we have put together a suite of proposals that Rachel Reeves could enact immediately in the budget she's about to announce that would amount to saving and raising £25 billion, more than enough to plug the black hole that she has created through her mad policies and negate the need for tax rises. And in most of the proposals we're announcing, the vast majority of them, it is foreign nationals who are being asked to deal with the difficult decisions and not British citizens. So let's run through them. The first one is welfare. Now, we've already announced that our belief is UK welfare should be for UK citizens. I think that's an entirely reasonable position. And yet the fastest growing line item in any welfare bill you look at where we actually have data is indeed foreign nationals. And data is a key point. One of the reasons why the establishment is so worried about Nigel becoming Prime Minister is because we will no longer hide the data on all of the line items of the welfare budget and usage of the NHS by foreign nationals. The government, the Tory government and Labour now continue to hide most of the line items in terms of how much demand there is on those services and welfare programs from foreign nationals. The exception is universal credit. And yeah, universal credit has been ballooning in terms of foreign nationals utilising it. So we are saying we will no longer, the British state should no longer pay universal credit payments to foreign nationals. The bill for that will be, in terms of how much that would foreign nationals are taking from universal credit, is £8 billion this year. We have assumed a 3-month notice period to be reasonable, and therefore if Rachel Reeves were to enact that policy, that would be £6 billion of savings this year. The next one is foreign aid. It is unconscionable that British citizens and taxpayers should be asked to fund foreign aid programs when, for example, 15-year-olds in Wales have a lower educational attainment than 15-year-olds in Turkey. And by the way, that number for Welsh 15-year-olds is below the OECD average. But I say Turkey for a reason, because the British taxpayer has been forced, because of the inept political leadership in this country, to send hundreds of millions of pounds in aid to Turkey, a country whose 15-year-olds do better than Welsh 15-year-olds. Charity begins at home, and that's before we even start talking about the fact that, for example, while Labour was resisting calls for a statutory national inquiry into the grooming gangs, they were wiring £19 million to Pakistan for child exploitation prevention programs. That is going to make British people's blood boil. It is unacceptable for us to continue to be funding foreign aid at this level while the country is in the state that it is currently in. Of course, we would aspire in the long run to do foreign aid. Why wouldn't we? But charity begins at home, and it is unacceptable to ask hard-working British people to pay ever more tax to fund these programs. So we are proposing a hard cap of £1 billion on foreign aid. That would still allow us to ring-fence our commitments to Ukraine, and it would allow us to keep our seats at multilaterals like the UN and the IMF. That would still save £10 billion a year. The next thing we can talk about is the immigration health surcharge. Now, this is actually quite extraordinary, because the government's own impact assessment, when it was recently increased to £1,000 roughly a year, stated very clearly that that £1,000 merely represented 38% of the actual per capita, i.e. per person, per year cost of using the NHS. That's literally in the document. That's not speculation. It's in the impact assessment. And yet the Tory government signed off on an effective 62% discount for foreign nationals to be able to use our NHS. And I'll give you just one example. And this is a very long document. It's online. You can go and read it. It's abundantly clear the government has actually got no idea how much the true cost of foreign nationals using our NHS actually is. But I'll give you just one data point to demonstrate why any sort of discount is totally morally reprehensible and economically illiterate. Let's look at maternity rates. The birth rate for foreign nationals relative to British citizens is about 30% higher. Each birth costs the NHS £5,500. That is one reason why, by the way, maternity wards, just like GP surgeries and many other parts of the NHS, are totally backed up. I want to give you another data point on the NHS, because we've already started doing quite a lot of work on what's gone wrong. And the fact of the matter is this: the population explosion has brought the NHS to its knees. Since 2010, the population in this country has grown by about 10%, roughly. And almost all of that, north of 90% of that, is through immigration. And what's happened to real, i.e. adjusted for inflation, NHS spending? It's almost doubled It's almost double to deal with a 10% increase in the population. And insanely, and again, we can thank the Tory government for this, the country has fewer NHS beds since 2010. So it is clear that the marginal cost to serve in pretty much every vector in the NHS scales in really non-linear fashion, in exponential fashion, once capacity constraints are exceeded. And that is exactly where we are. Unless we get this population explosion under control, and Nigel has talked about this for decades, the NHS will not be able to recover, and that is really important. We can make a start. We can make a start by no longer offering foreign nationals a 62% discount on being able to use our NHS. We can then talk about foreign prisoners. So we've known for some time now that north of 10,000 foreign nationals languish in our prisons, and remarkably, countries like Pakistan, to whom this country sends hundreds of millions of pounds in aid every year, our inept politicians, for whatever reason, are unable to even get Pakistan to take back their convicted criminals who are sitting in our jails. And we're still sending them hundreds of millions of pounds in foreign aid and issuing them visas in all sorts of different ways. And then so that would save £500 million adjusted for deportation costs. That's based on onward data that was published this week. And then you have the PIP announcements, the PIP reforms that Lee Anderson and I announced recently. Now, by the way, most of these numbers, Nigel mentioned ILR, the numbers I'm giving you, the $6 billion in the form of savings this year if we were to halt welfare universal credit payments alone to foreign nationals, the $10 billion saving in foreign aid, the $5 billion, by the way, that the immigration surcharge increase would raise this year. All of these numbers compound at dramatic rates over the coming years. Those numbers I've given you are just for this fiscal year, because we're talking about plugging the black hole and negating the need for tax rises. But to give you an idea on this, in that press conference we said by 2029 the PIP reforms that Lee and I proposed would save £9 billion per year in 2029, namely no longer paying for non-serious anxiety, but actually putting those people on back-to-work programs, which all of the academic research in Europe shows that is the best possible thing you could actually do for the recipients of that welfare too, many of whom are very young and being tossed on the scrap heap. But this year, that would still save £3.5 billion. So you top all of those numbers up, you get to above £25 billion. And these are savings that Rachel Reeves could choose to make in her budget that is coming up. We urge her to make these changes. And the fact that despite us doing this press conference and our pleas, the likelihood she will choose not to do those things and instead choose to raise taxes on British people is because Labour is making the conscious and deliberate decision to continue funding extortionate amounts to foreign nationals to the detriment of British citizens. And I don't know what to call that, frankly, in my view, is treachery. I think it's appalling. British people are sick and tired of it. So those are our proposals. And we're pleading with Rachel Reeves, let's enact these, let's raise and save £25 billion, plug the black hole that you've created and put British people first. Thank you very much.